Okay, so what I want to talk to you about this afternoon is part of a general theoretical project that we have up at Brookes, which is to develop the notions of evolutionary economics with respect to geography and with particular respect to the analysis of the long-term development of city regions and their economies. As yet, this is a fairly underdeveloped theoretical area, so there's no settled agreement on what the basic concepts should be, or indeed the direction of analysis. So there are basically three approaches that have been adopted, and we've looked at these three. There's generalized Darwinism, which, as the name suggests, seeks to take Darwin's principles of evolution and apply them in economic circumstances. There's path dependence theory, which again looks at the relationship between history and the development of economies, and in our case, development of city regions. And of particular interest there is the whole notion of new path creation, which is something that we're working on at the moment, which deals with how new industries get started in particular places and the conditions which foster those kind of creative developments. And the third and least developed element of evolutionary theory is complexity theory, and the analysis of aspects of what are described as far from equilibrium adaptive systems with characteristics emerging in conditions of self-organization, and where adaptation is one of the key phenomena or processes within these systems. And so what I'm going to do then is just look at one small example of the use of complexity theory from an evolutionary perspective and apply it to the analysis of city regions. What I'm going to say tonight is actually taken from a paper that I wrote with Ron Martin from Cambridge, which was published in a special edition of CJ Res, which is devoted entirely to this whole issue of resilience and what it means, how it may be applied, particularly in city regional contexts. So that's the advertising for this evening, but I recommend it to you if you want to look further into the notion of resilience. From that paper, I'm just going to deal with these five main topics. First of all, I want to make the point that evolutionary economics is a heterodox system. It has some interesting arguments with neoclassical economics, particularly the notion that equilibrium is essentially confined to abstract neoclassical models and is not usually found in real-world situations. Looking at the approach from evolutionary economics that deals with complex adaptive systems and what that means, then taking one example that's been used to analyse both ecosystems and the development of economies, that's panarchy, with some examples of that kind of analysis looking at capital accumulation and resilience in a couple of cities, Cambridge and Swansea, and also looking at the effects of recessionary shocks on resilience in cities of that type. So, one of the reasons why the special edition of CJ Res was because of the perceived growing contemporary relevance of this whole notion of resilience. I think the three basic reasons for this. One is the lessons learnt, or indeed not learnt, from the devastation caused by Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, and the the fact that a lot of New Orleans is still derelict after the hurricane, largely as a result of the lack of either private insurance or state aid. Secondly, there's interest in resilience in the context of the recessionary shock that we've just been through or are coming out of. And thirdly, because of the neo-Thatcherite cutbacks in public expenditure which are being implemented over the next 4 years, which will throw cities and regions back more on their own resources, and therefore will raise the salience of resilience as a way of coping with these cutbacks. So the first point is that evolutionary economics, in most cases anyway, argues that equilibrium is an entirely theoretical concept, doesn't exist in real economies. And so what we're interested then is in non-equilibrium situations where we can look at resilience as an evolutionary concept, that's to say one that explains the development over the long term of certain urban characteristics. And we're interested in the differential ability of places, firms, to adapt to changes in competitive markets, to technologies, to policy changes, and so on. Now, the evolutionary position on this is essentially that economic evolution depends on the actions of individual agents. And unlike the average agent in neoclassical economics, individual economic agents are able to learn and to innovate and to change their behaviour according to the circumstances in which they find themselves. And so this is one of the major reasons why evolutionary economics would argue that economies can never be in equilibrium. And some work by these three, Metcalfe, Fosker and Ramlogan, on the relationship between modern economics and knowledge argue that because modern economies are essentially driven by knowledge and knowledge never stands still, then the economies can't be in equilibrium, and that we have to think of capitalism as an inherently restless process. The most extreme form of which, of course, are the gales of creative destruction, which Schumpeter talked about way back in the late 1930s, early 1940s. And this is just a quote from Ramlogan and Metcalfe, where what they're essentially arguing is that economies are based on knowledge. And although you can detect structure and pattern in the use of knowledge, this is not the same as equilibrium. And that if knowledge did ever reach an equilibrium or fail to keep changing, then in their eyes, economic development would cease altogether. So what we're dealing with in this perspective is a complex system where knowledge is the key economic resource, and where it is continually evolving at different rates, sometimes very fast, sometimes not so fast. And as a result of the evolution of knowledge, economies will adapt or will need to adapt, and those that don't will soon suffer from economic problems. So this is the a typical basic starting point for evolutionary economics with respect to trying to understand urban and regional economies. So from an evolutionary perspective then, an important attribute of regional economic resilience is the adaptive capacity of local economies. How do they change as knowledge changes and develops? And so in this conception, what matters for the long run success of a regional economy is the ability of the labour force, technological expertise, institutional structures and so on, to adapt to market pressures which are imposed on city and regional economies from outside because they are so open. They have no boundaries like nations do. So what we're dealing with in terms of city economies are very open systems with no clearly definable economic boundaries. And from an evolutionary perspective then, any convincing theory needs to be able to explain how these adaptive capacities develop through time. They don't just emerge overnight. They are built up as a result of learning, and learning can take some considerable time. As I'll show in one of the examples, we're talking decades here rather than years or indeed the life of a single parliament. So there are various models of complex adaptive systems, and in this particular branch of evolutionary economics, it's argued that we should look at complex adaptive systems and see what they can tell us about understanding the development of urban economies. Now, what do we mean by a complex adaptive system? What would it look like if we saw one? These are a number of key characteristics which will crop up later in the talk, but just to go through them very briefly. First of all, a system will have characteristics which operate across the system but will be connected to each other. So there will be relationships distributed across the system, and there will be degrees of connectivity. Now that's quite an important concept, connectivity, which I'm going to come back to in a minute. As I've already said, the boundaries between complex adaptive systems and their environments, particularly their economic environments, are not fixed. They're not easy to identify. And so what we're dealing with is constant interchange between the entities that we're interested in, such as urban economies, and their external economic environments, such as their national economy or the global economy. A third basic characteristic is that we're dealing with nonlinear dynamic systems where a constant system of feedbacks and self-reinforcing interactions drives the system on, but can also lead to path dependence. In other words, in certain circumstances, these systems can get locked in to a particular technology or a particular form of production. And as we'll see later on, this is one of the characteristics of cities that are lagging in economic terms. They get locked into old industries, and we need to understand why that is and why it's so difficult to break out of those lock-ins. Another key characteristic of complex systems is that the characteristics themselves are emergent and based on self-organization. In other words, there's no guiding mind in charge of these systems. There's no guiding mind in charge of an urban economy. The characteristics that it takes on and that evolve are the result of multiple actions by lots of actors, both within those economies and outside them. And so the characteristics that emerge through time then are said to be emergent, and the system itself will have self-organizing properties which will lead to these characteristics. And finally, this whole process of self-organization in complex systems is the basis of their ability to interact with their external environments. And so some forms of self-organisation make urban economies more adaptable to what's happening in their external environments, and some make them less adaptable, or in fact make it very difficult for them to adapt to changes in external economic circumstances. So any approach to a complex adaptive systems analysis of urban economies needs to think about these 5 different characteristics and how they influence what we can see empirically on the ground. Now, with respect to regional and urban economies, in the adaptive systems literature, they tend to be characterized by 2 conflicting tendencies. On the one hand, there's this tendency towards increasing connectedness and order. Now, as I said earlier, this notion of connectedness is very significant, because in quite a lot of the territorial innovation studies, that's to say studies of what makes regions and cities innovative and successful economically, internal connectedness and networks are often argued to be as it were, a good thing in inverted commas, that network production systems in Emilia-Romagna or Silicon Valley have been said to be important positive features of those systems. In this conception, that's not the case, that connectedness actually can lead to a parochial, inward-looking lack of ability to adapt and change. So there's a serious argument here with the territorial innovation models. And so connectedness then is in tension with the potential to reduce the adaptability of the system to changes in environmental conditions. In other words, the more connected an internal system is, it's potentially less able to adapt to forces from outside, in for example, a city economy, national economic forces, global economic forces. And so this implies that there's a conflict or trade-off between connectedness and resilience. That what you would expect to find in more connected systems would be less resilience, and in the less connected or the more externally connected systems you would expect to find higher resilience. And so this is an interesting trade-off which comes up again in the panarchy model that I'm going to talk about in a minute. So one example of complex adaptive systems is this panarchy model, which has been developed pretty much in Berkeley, where it started off as a concern with how ecosystems recover from major shocks, but has subsequently been adapted to looking at regional economies and how they change through time. And what it argues is that, in principle, the contradiction between connectedness and adaptation is resolved in a 4-phase process where change is continual, and through time systems, in this case economic systems, will go through a series of regular phases. And each of these phases is characterized by the potential or actual characteristics of accumulated resources, of internal connectedness, and then consequentially resilience. Now, what might those things mean in practice? Well, Translated into a spatial economic context, then accumulated resources would include such as this list here. So we're talking about the competencies of firms in places, in localities. We're talking about the quality and skills of the workforce. We're talking about the co-evolution of institutional forms and arrangements with economic change in those places. We're talking about physical and soft infrastructures, so transport and communication being physical, institutional arrangements, tacit knowledge being soft infrastructures. And in the evolutionary context, these would depend on previous forms and structures of economic and social development in the region. So in this sense, history matters, that these are built up through time, and as I said at the beginning, they're not something which can be parachuted into an urban economy overnight. They're something which takes a long time to develop, and so the accumulated resources that you see in an economy today are the result of long-term changes and adaptation within those particular economies. Internal connectedness, what would that mean? Well, that would be illustrated by patterns of traded and untraded interdependencies among local firms. So supply inputs might be traded, but lower down you see knowledge spillovers. They would be untraded, but would be a significant form of connectedness. Networks of trust. Again, in the territorial innovation models, networks of trust are regarded as very important and normally a good thing to have. Business associations, the kind of chambers of commerce type organizations, and interfirm patterns of labor mobility. So these would be the empirical basis of connectedness in a particular urban economy. And finally, resilience then. What would lead to resilience or a lack thereof? This would include innovation and the innovative capacities of local firms. It would include the entrepreneurial culture. For example, what's the rate of new firm formation in a urban economy? Institutional innovations, do the institutions of an economy prevent adaptation, or do they co-evolve with economic change to facilitate adaptation? Access to such things as venture capital, and also the willingness of workers to reskill and change on a regular basis. So those would be the kind of empirical characteristics of these three main aspects of the panarchy model. Now, coming on to the panarchy model, which is essentially, it's not a theory, it's a description of phases through which economies may go. It contains really two major loops. There's one that relates to the emergence, development, and eventual stabilization of an economy. So this is from exploitation to conservation. And then a second loop which follows those two, or that one, which relates to the decline of an existing structure and the opening up of new types of activity, or the potential for new types of activity. And this is the release and reorganization loop. Diagrammatically, we can look at it this way. So if you look at the bottom left-hand corner, we have the initial exploitation phase, where this is where a new economic pathway is being created, where a new industry is emerging, where innovation is taking place, where in this theory anyway, connectedness is low. So a lot of the activity is freestanding. It may be more connected with actors outside the local economy than inside the local economy. And for this reason, resilience is also high. And this is where you see growth, seizing of opportunities. As those opportunities are seized, we move into the conservation phase, where connectedness becomes high, and as a result of that, resilience declines. So although this can be an economically successful phase, the economy becomes more stable and can become more rigid. If that happens and an industry that has those kind of characteristics goes into decline, then we have the second loop, which is the release phase and on to reorganisation phase. So if a particular industry goes into serious decline, as most of the heavy industries in the UK have done, so you then get, theoretically anyway, the destruction of those industries, you get the release of resources, and so this leads on to the possibility for reorganisation, for the development of new industries, or in some circumstances the adaptation of old industries, and where you see resilience increasing and rates of innovation also increasing. So that is a sort of stylized version of the phases through which an urban economy or a regional economy is like to go through as it adapts over time. And so we have these four basic phases. We have the exploitation phase, conservation phase, decline and release, leading on to reorganisation and the development of new industries. Now we can look at this across time rather than in the static picture that the last model showed, where as an economy goes through these phases, the argument is that capital accumulation is changing and so is resilience. So during the reorganisation, restructuring, where innovation is high, then you can see resilience is depicted in this stylized diagram as being high. As you move on to the conservation phase, where the economy is becoming more stable, not to say rigid, so you see resilience declining. And so these phases proceed through time. The main point of this is that resilience is not a given characteristic which doesn't change through time. So that in this argument anyway, resilience changes through time according to the phase of adaptation through which an urban economy is going. Another interesting feature of the panarchy model is that it deals with different scales. So obviously one of the most important external factors for urban economies is the national economy. What happens in the national economy, what happens in the national business cycle has major impacts on what happens in city economies. And so the argument is then that larger scales affect smaller scales, but at the same time those smaller scales can impact back on the larger scale. One version of this is this model developed in Berkeley, where you have the larger scales, obviously the larger loops, and the smaller scale being something like an urban economy being the smaller loops. And so they go through similar phases and influence each other as they go through these phases. So you have the exploitation phase with slow growth but innovation. You have K, the conservation phase, where you end up with peak capital accumulation. You then have the omega phase with rapid destruction or collapse of particular industries, and then so on to alpha with reorganization and restructuring. So the interesting thing about this model is that it tries to link up, albeit without any major empirical examples yet, it tries to link up the different scales of economic activity. So you could think of this, for example, as an attempt to link what's happening in the national economy with its impact and adaptation on urban economies at the smaller scale. So what might all this mean in practice? Well, we've done a few studies of different cities for different purposes, and in this particular case we picked out 2 city regions with markedly different economic histories over the past half a century or so. As we all know, in Oxford, Cambridge is widely regarded as one of the UK's most successful, innovative, high-tech and knowledge-based local economies. And it's therefore the kind of economy that we might expect to be adaptable and therefore to be resilient. The city region of Swansea, on the other hand, although in historical terms, back in the early 70s, it started from pretty much a similar economic position to Cambridge, has had a quite different history and has struggled to recover from loss of its first main economic role, which was in mining. It struggled to recover from FDI in electronics, which came in and then went out again. And so Swansea is an example of a city economy that hasn't adapted very well, and therefore you wouldn't expect to be characterised by high degrees of resilience. The other point to notice is, again, we're looking at the development of resilience and adaptation over long periods of time. So in these 2 case studies, we were looking at the 2 cities from the early 1970s up to the present time. Now, this isn't an eye test. I'm not sure whether you can read it on the screen, but this is basically a comparison of the major phases according to the panarchy model for Cambridge and Swansea. The simplest correspondence with these 4 phases can be seen in the Swansea economy, where back in the 1960s you can see the decline of the mining industries. At one time, something like 80% of all the world's copper was exported through Swansea docks. That declined rapidly. And so by the 70s, most of those mining industries had gone completely. So they went into a reorganisation phase where, because of the lack of indigenous strengths to build on, they decided to foster foreign direct investment and decided electronics was the future at that time. And so brought in Sony and later on Hitachi and Panasonic in an electronics industry. Unfortunately, this industry was essentially only assembly of technologies that were developed back in Japan. And so they were given cathode ray tubes to manufacture. They were one of Europe's leading centres for the manufacture of cathode ray tubes, and also VCR technology. So for a short period of time, there was exploitation along these electronics industries, but as soon as the new technologies were developed of flat screen televisions and also CD recorders, the technology was taken or started up in places like Barcelona. So the industry is closed almost overnight in Swansea. One respondent told us an entire factory was taken away on half a dozen lorries over one weekend. So very rapid decline in that industry. And so then we go into another reorganisation phase where they have started in Swansea a Technium programme, which is a very small-scale attempt to incubate high-tech industries and hopefully develop them into a new economic activity for Swansea. We'll see how successful that's been in a minute. Cambridge, on the other hand, has taken a long time not to go through so many cycles. Back in the 60s, its GDP per head was pretty much the same as Swansea. Cambridge had been essentially an agricultural economy, but around the 60s, with for example, some Cambridge graduates formed Cambridge consultants for proposing engineering solutions to other people's technological problems. The whole high-tech economy began to take off in Cambridge. It took the better part of 20 years, however, so it was slow development. It wasn't overnight. But even when we come up to the 80s and 90s, we can see that those developments are still being exploited. So instead of having an industrial collapse as happened in Swansea, Cambridge was still developing and adapting and changing its industries. It's now questionable whether the momentum has gone out of that continual change, and it may very well be that Cambridge is now involved in a conservation phase of previous technologies. So what would that look like if we compare the two in this stylized form? So what we're harping back to the earlier graph that I showed you of capital accumulation versus resilience. If we look at these in the case of Cambridge and Swansea, we can see that in historical terms, it looks as though Cambridge has adapted and had more resilience than the Swansea economy over a longer period. Swansea has gone through 2 cycles, whereas Cambridge has not completed 1 cycle over this 20, 30-year period. So a big difference in resilience between the 2 economies. How does that play out in terms of economic change? Well, if we look at their resilience in the face of major economic shocks, of which recessions are the most obvious ones that we can recognise earlier. Here, if we look at the change in total employment in Cambridge and Swansea from 1980 onwards, we can see, as I said earlier, that they both start from pretty similar positions with similar amounts of employment and not too different GDPs per capita. The Swansea is less resilient to, total Swansea employment is less resilient to the early 80s recession. It declines, recovers a bit before the next recession, but doesn't recover to its original level. Falls again during the 90 recession, and then has increased very slowly up until these figures, which were unfortunately just before, from our perspective anyway, just before the 08-09 recession. Cambridge in total, you can see a somewhat similar pattern, although recovery and resilience are higher, so it is hit by recessionary shocks, but then recovers and soon exceeds the previous level. So in total employment terms, Cambridge appears to have been more resilient to these major economic shocks than Swansea. The big difference comes in manufacturing, and this is fairly typical of the kind of cities that have been dependent on manufacturing in the UK economy. So with the recession, manufacturing declines markedly. And in the case of Swansea, it declines markedly, it then doesn't recover before the next recession, it then declines again markedly, and then up until '08 hadn't recovered to the pre-90 recession levels. So manufacturing tends to ratchet down with recessions, and in this case indicates a lack of adaptation and resilience. Cambridge, on the other hand, you can see, although manufacturing is hit by the recession, so that it does have a shock, it does have an impact, manufacturing then has recovered and has continued and is not so different in '08 as it was from back in 1980. So at least in Cambridge, there's some evidence of resilience and adaptation in manufacturing employment. With respect to services, one of the things you see is that services are impacted by recession, but then have also recovered, more so in Cambridge and less so in Swansea. But although I don't have figures for Cambridge and Swansea, this is not necessarily all that it seems in terms of resilience. We have another study of the West Midlands, which looks at the difference between private and public sector employment. So when you disaggregate this, what you find is that it's essentially the public services which have contributed a great deal to service employment growth in these kind of cities. They've also been in more or less Keynesian terms, growing counter-cyclically during recessions. So you can see even in the West Midlands, public services were increasing in the 1992 recession, whereas private employment in general has continued along pretty much the same level as it was all the way back in 1971. So this obviously has interesting implications for what's going to happen if we're going to take £20 billion out of public services, and with significant impacts on public employment over the next 4 years, and whether or not it's realistic to expect that the private sector will take up the difference and will be able to produce more jobs than are lost in the public sector. So these are the kind of issues that are being raised by the study of resilience and adaptation. And there I'll leave it for this evening.
Thank you.